Good morning. Welcome to our study this morning. Today's study will be a little different than usual, but we'll begin in our usual manner. If you need to utilize 1 John 1:9 to confess any known sins to the Father before we begin, you may do that now during our silent prayer time. And we will move forward with the study if everything moves along smoothly here with our technical issues. Please pray with me. Father, as we study this hour, we ask that you show us through the Spirit the truth and the falsehood that we'll be looking at during our hour together, and that you show us how human viewpoint differs from divine viewpoint. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. As I said, today's study will be a little different. I'll be out of town next week, and we won't have Bible class. And we're just getting ready to begin covering the Enneagram Type 9 personality. And I wouldn't be able to do it all in 1 week. So rather than have it broken up by a week's absence, I decided to insert today a part of our study that I have been preparing for quite some time to do, and decided that this would be a good opportunity to do it. As you can see from the title, it's called The Human Viewpoint of Human Happiness, and we will go through the notes. You'll notice that there are only 4 pages of notes for this, and today's Bible class will consist of videos of some of the world's leading experts on happiness. These experts will discuss, for the most part, the materialist evolutionist point of view with a little of their acceptable religious approach, which will, of course, be non-Christian. Please note the references to the failure of various happiness attainment motivators and the alternative approach of other hams to attain happiness. Remember, the hams are chemical, religious, approbation, materialism, power, and sex. So here we go, if everything works well.
Tonight, we talk about happiness, that quirky, elusive emotion that the Declaration of Independence maintains we have every right to pursue. And man, do we pursue it. We're suckers for an endless stream of self-help books that promise a carefree existence for a mere $24.95. Television hucksters of every kind claim they have the key to nirvana. So the happiness business, at least, is one big smiley face. As for the rest of us, well, the main scientific survey of international happiness carried out by Leicester University in England ranks the U.S. a distant 23rd, well behind Canada and Costa Rica. But you'll be pleased to know we beat Iraq and Pakistan. And the winner is, once again, Denmark. Over the past 30 years, in survey after survey, this nation of 5.5 million people, the land that produced Hans Christian Andersen, the people who consume herring by the ton, consistently beat the rest of the world in the happiness stakes. It's hard to figure. The weather is only so-so. They're heavy drinkers and smokers. Their neighbors, the Norwegians, are richer, and their other neighbors, the Swedes, are healthier. So it's ironic or something that the unhappiest man in history, or at least literary history, was that Prince of Denmark, Hamlet, who lived in this gloomy rock pile at Elsinore. Of course, Hamlet had every right to be depressed. After all, his uncle murdered his father, seduced and married his mother, and was an all-around perfect scoundrel. But Hamlet aside, what makes a Dane so happy? And why isn't he wallowing in misery and self-doubt like so many of the rest of us? That's a question that also intrigued Professor Kåre Christensen at the University of Southern Denmark.
If you ask people on the street where they think the happiest country in the world is, they'll say, like tropical islands and, nice places, like Italy or Spain, places with nice weather and good food. But in Europe, they're actually the most unhappy people.
So Dr. Christensen and a team of researchers tried to discover just why Denmark finds itself on top of the happiness heap.
We made fun of it by suggesting it could be because blondes have more fun, but then we could prove that the Swedes have more blondes than the Danes, and they were not as happy. So we tested different hypotheses.
So the result is blondes don't necessarily have more fun.
Exactly. So, but it doesn't hurt either.
After careful study, Dr. Christensen thinks he isolated the key to Danish anti-depression.
What we basically figured out that although the Danes were very happy with their life, when we looked at their expectations, they were pretty modest.
So by having low expectations, you're rarely disappointed.
Exactly.
Dr. Christensen's study was called Why Danes Are Smug, and essentially his answer was it's because they're so glum and get happy when things turn out not quite so badly as they expected.
I was thinking about what if it was opposite, that Denmark maybe was number 20 and another country was number 1. I'm pretty sure the Danish television will say, well, number 20 is not too bad, it's still in the top 25, and, that's not too bad.
History may also play a role in the country's culture of low expectations. If you go to the government's own website, it proudly proclaims, the present configuration of the country is the result of 400 years of forced relinquishments of land, surrenders, and lost battles. Could it be that the true secret of happiness is a swift kick in the pants or a large dose of humiliation? Do you think there's some kind of inverse relationship between, the more powerful you are, the more unhappy you are, and the weaker you are, the happier you are?
Well, at least the pressure is off you, And if you're doing pretty well and once in a while it's outstanding, you're very happy about it. But if your starting point is that you should be outstanding, that's not good.
Do Danes like being slightly in the shadows?
I think it's a little bit like in bicycling race. You like to come from behind.
Which is exactly what the underdog Danes did in the 1992 European Soccer Championship. Christensen says it created such a state of euphoria that the country has not been the same since. But is there more to it? We asked Danish newspaper columnist Sebastian Dorset what he thought about Denmark's #1 status.
If you didn't tell me about the survey, I wouldn't believe that Denmark was the happiest place because everybody complains all the time.
I find it fascinating that you say people complain, but there is a real sense of contentment here.
Yeah.
Dorset says that contentment may stem from the fact that Denmark is almost totally homogeneous, has no large disparities of wealth, and has had very little national turmoil for more than half a century.
We have very little violence, we have very little murder, so people feel very safe.
People feel secure.
Yes, a knife stabbing makes the front page every time. I don't think that happens in America very often.
Happy as they may be, Dorset says, Danes rarely show it.
People are not looking very happy in the street. They don't talk very much.
So people don't just strike up casual conversations on the train?
No, never. I think actually there's a very highly developed body language when if you are stuck on the window seat of a bus and wants to get out and there's a person next to you on the aisle seat, then you don't say, excuse me, could I please get off? You start rattling your bags and make sort of a gesture saying, I'm about to get up, so please get up so I don't have to talk to you.
Well, is it shyness or what?
I don't know, it's sort of it's considered a right by Danish people not to be talked to.
Danish students can fairly be described as utterly laid back. Even so, they're surprised to be told they live in Happinessville.
When I go abroad, I usually see people look much more happy. For example, in Southern Europe, they go about in the streets laughing much more than we do. I think you could say maybe we are more content.
What's the distinction you make between happiness and contentedness?
Well, if you're content, you don't have so much to worry about. That's what I think.
For example, no student loans hanging over their heads. All education is free in Denmark, right on through university, and students can take as long as they like to complete their studies.
We get paid to go to school, actually. Instead of in the US, you pay to go to school, we get paid to go to school if we pass our exams.
Americans watching this, particularly people your age, would be bowled over by the very idea that the government pays you to go to school.
I'm being paid right now for not going to school. I'm being paid for parenting.
Oh, you're on paternity leave.
Yes, it's 100% paid for by the government for half a year.
Denmark also provides free health care, subsidized child care, and elder care. A social safety net spread the length and breadth of the country.
I mean, we're pretty much free to do whatever we want. We secure it from the day we're born. For a Dane who lives in Denmark.
Fish and beeraholics they may be, but workaholics they are not. In Denmark, the average work week is what?
37?
37 hours. And how much vacation?
6 weeks?
There are billionaires in the United States who don't get 6 weeks vacations.
Maybe they should.
But in getting all those wonderful gifts from the government, the Danes do pay a price. How much would a sort of middle-income person pay in taxes?
About 50. Half.
And that is one trade-off most Americans are not willing to make. Americans, according to Harvard psychology lecturer Tal Ben-Shahar, want it all.
In America, part of the ethos, part of the American dream is that more is better. And the more is better usually applies to the material realm. And that doesn't pan out, that doesn't work. It doesn't make us happier.
Ben-Shahar teaches a course at Harvard called Positive Psychology, the Science of Happiness. He began the class 4 years ago, and it became the most popular course on campus, enrolling 1,400 students. In the U.S., the quest for happiness begins in what's alleged to be the happiest years of our lives.
There's a lot of unhappiness on college campuses, and it's not just at Harvard. Over 94% of college students nationwide are stressed and overwhelmed, and students are paying a very high price for this pressure.
That pressure is a result of high expectations. Wanting it all is a bacterium that stays with us from youth to old age. Wanting a bigger house, fancier car, more stuff. And when we get more, there's always someone with even more stuff who's just as unhappy. Some suggest that the unhappiest zip codes in the country are the wealthiest, like the Upper East Side of New York.
The number one predictor of well-being is close friendships and close relationships in general, which includes, of course, family relationships. Much better predictor of well-being than affluence is.
Ben-Shahar says Americans could learn a lot about happiness from the Danes.
It is about having realistic expectations. It's about not trying to fit in more than we can handle. We can't handle it all. We can't have it all, but we can have a lot.
You've lived in the States. You've visited the
Yes.
States. Would you live there?
It's got a grandness to it that you can never imagine here in Denmark because it's a much larger scale and the differences are much bigger. But I wouldn't want my children to grow up there.
Just describe for me the qualities that a successful person would have in this country.
Well, in order to see myself as a success, I want to be happy and have a lot of time with my family. I think that's very important to me. And the money is not that important.
It is more about the softer values, such as not being stressed and feeling passionate about what I'm doing. And maybe this job is not going to pay me a lot of money, but I'm going to love getting up and doing it every day.
Do you think that you can equate money with happiness?
No. If you have a sufficient amount of money, then I don't think it will make you a lot happier to get really rich. And we're already at a good level here in Denmark, so I don't think we'll be happier if we increase our wealth.
But these unmelancholy Danes, as laid back as they are, do not lack ambition.
I think that we have very high hopes, just like any other people do. We just don't get so disappointed when we don't see them through.
What would you advise Americans to do?
I have an advice. Don't depend too much on the American dream. Yeah. I think you might get disappointed.
our series, Personal Best, the keys to really having a happy new year. Our next guest says most people can be a lot happier, and she says she has scientific research to prove it. She is Professor Sonia Lubomirsky. I'm happy that I got it. And she has spent close to 20 years studying happiness, and her strategies for a happier you are in a new book. It's called The How of Happiness. And seeing a cherry pie on the cover makes a lot of people happy right off the bat.
Thank you.
It is very good to meet you.
You too, thank you.
It's a scientific approach because there are a lot of books out there on happiness and to help people. But what really struck me with this, you said 40% of happiness we have control over. We can do it.
Yeah,
what do you mean by 40%?
That's right. You know, the basic premise is that despite the fact that our happiness is partly genetically determined, and despite the fact that our life circumstances have a surprisingly small influence on how happy we are, still a large portion of happiness, up to 40%, is in our power to change by the things that we do in our lives, the ways that we think and the ways that we act in our daily lives. There are a lot of happiness manuals out there, you know, as you know, in the bookstores. But I think that I'm the first author of a How to Be Happy book who actually does research with my colleague Ken Sheldon on how people can be made sustainably happier. And I think that's...
There are basically 12 principles or strategies
That's
that you
right.
said, beginning with gratitude, that attitude of gratitude, which is really so key and important.
Yeah, I mean, gratitude means thanking someone who's been meaningful in your life or influential. In fact, I just wrote an email this morning to my favorite high school history teachers, thanking him for what he's done. It means counting your blessings. It means not taking things for granted. And you can keep a gratitude diary, or you can write a letter of gratitude. There's many ways to do that.
And the kindness, because we've heard this, especially coming off the holiday season, and it was so great to give gifts and to see the reaction from people. Even giving you corn dogs made us happy this morning, but just those acts of kindness.
Yeah, I mean, kindness is a very simple strategy. I mean, we all know how to do it. You just do good things for other people. And it turns out, you know, studies from my lab show that people who commit acts of kindness on a regular basis become significantly happier over time. And it's partly because you see yourself as a good person when you're nice to others. And also when you're nice to others, they appreciate it and they like you more. You might make new friends when you're kind.
Now, another principle is it's tough for some people about forgiveness. You know, you can forget some things, but it's so hard sometimes to give that forgiveness, but you feel so much better if you're able to do that.
Exactly. I think forgiveness is the hardest strategy that I talk about. I mean, it involves letting go of feelings of resentment and anger and vengeance that you might have for someone who's wronged you or hurt you. You know, and I'm the first to acknowledge that some acts may be unforgivable. But if you're ready to forgive, studies show that it can work to make you happier. People who practice empathy, who visualize forgiveness, who write forgiveness letters, they feel less anxious, their relationships improve over time.
Especially over time. We were talking in the commercial break, and I thought it was fascinating in your book, about how you can tell with an older person if they've been a happy or not so happy person in their life.
Yeah, it's fascinating, but you know, if you're a happy person, you tend to smile more, and so those lines of those smiling, crinkly lines get etched on your face, and if you are an unhappy person, you tend to frown more, and so when you look at an older person, their personality is kind of etched on their face.
Yeah, it's right there for us to see.
Yeah.
Also, identical twins. Now, this one was very fascinating, and it's something that is going to be
When I was president of the American Psychological Association, they tried to media train me. And an encounter I had with CNN summarizes what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the 11th reason to be optimistic. The editor of Discover told us 10 of them. I'm going to give you the 11th. So they came to me, CNN, and they said, Professor Seligman, would you tell us about the state of psychology today? We'd like to interview you about that. And I said, great. He said, but this is CNN, so you only get a soundbite. So, well, how many words do I get? I said, well, one. Cameras rolled, and she said, Professor Seligman, what is the state of psychology today? Good. Cut. That won't do. We'd really better give you a longer soundbite. Well, how many words do I get this time? You get 2. Dr. Seligman, what is the state of psychology today? Not good. Look, Dr. Seligman, we can see you're really not comfortable in this medium. We'd better give you a real soundbite. This time you can have 3 words. And Professor Seligman, what is the state of psychology today? Not good enough. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to say why psychology was good, why it was not good, and how it may become in the next 10 years good enough. And by parallel summary, I want to say the same thing about technology, about entertainment and design, because I think the issues are very similar. So why was psychology good? Well, for more than 60 years, psychology worked within the disease model. 10 years ago when I was on an airplane and I introduced myself to my seatmate and told them what I did, they'd move away from me. And because quite rightly, they were saying psychology is about finding what's wrong with you, spot the loony. And now when I tell people what I do, they move toward me. And what was good about psychology, about the $30 billion investment NIMH made, about working in the disease model, about what you mean by psychology, is that 60 years ago, none of the disorders were treatable. It was entirely smoke and mirrors. And now 14 of the disorders are treatable, 2 of them actually curable. And the other thing that happened is that a science developed, a science of mental illness, that we found out that we could take fuzzy concepts like depression, alcoholism, and measure them with rigor. That we could create a classification of the mental illnesses. That we could understand the causality of the mental illnesses. We could look across time at the same people, for example, who are genetically vulnerable to schizophrenia, and ask what the contribution of mothering, of genetics are, and we could isolate third variables by doing experiments on the mental illnesses. And best of all, we were able in the last 50 years to invent drug treatments and psychological treatments, and then we were able to test them rigorously in random assignment, placebo-controlled designs, throw out the things that didn't work, keep the things that actively did. And the conclusion of that is that psychology and psychiatry of the last 60 years can actually claim that we can make miserable people less miserable. And I think that's terrific. I'm proud of it. But what was not good, the consequences of that, were 3 things. The first was moral, that psychologists and psychiatrists became victimologists, pathologizers, that our view of human nature was that if you were in trouble, bricks fell on you. And we forgot that people made choices and decisions. We forgot responsibility. That was the first cost. The second cost was that we forgot about you people. We forgot about improving normal lives. We forgot about a mission to make relatively untroubled people happier, more fulfilled, more productive. And genius, high talent, became a dirty word. No one works on that. And the third problem about the disease model is in our rush to do something about people in trouble, in our rush to do something about repairing damage, it never occurred to us to develop interventions to make people happier, positive interventions. So that was not good. And so that's what led people like Nancy Etkoff, Dan Gilbert, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, myself to work in something I call positive psychology, which has 3 aims. The first is that psychology should be just as concerned with human strength as it is with weakness. It should be just as concerned with building strength as with repairing damage. It should be interested in the best things in life, and it should be just as concerned with making the lives of normal people fulfilling and with genius, with nurturing high talent. So, in the last 10 years, and the hope for the future, we've seen the beginnings of a science of positive psychology, a science of what makes life worth living. It turns out that we can measure different forms of happiness, and any of you for free can go to that website and take the entire panoply of tests of happiness. You can ask, how do you stack up for positive emotion, for meaning, for flow, against literally tens of thousands of other people? We created the opposite of the diagnostic manual of the insanities, a classification of the strengths and virtues that looks at the sex ratio, how they're defined, how to diagnose them, what builds them and what gets in their way. We found that we could discover the causation of the positive states, the relationship between left hemispheric activity and right hemispheric activity as a cause of happiness. I've spent my life working on extremely miserable people, and I've asked the question, how do extremely miserable people differ from the rest of you? And starting about 6 years ago, we asked about extremely happy people, and how do they differ from the rest of us? And it turns out there's one way, very surprised, they're not more religious, they're not in better shape, they don't have more money, they're not better looking, they don't have more good events and fewer bad events. The one way in which they differ, they're extremely social. They don't sit in seminars on Saturday morning. They don't spend time alone. Each of them is in a romantic relationship, and each has a rich repertoire of friends. But watch out here. This is merely correlational data, not causal, and it's about happiness in the first Hollywood sense I'm going to talk about. Happiness of ebullience and giggling and good cheer. And I'm going to suggest to you that's not nearly enough in just a moment. We found we could begin to look at interventions over the centuries, from the Buddha to Tony Robbins. About 120 interventions have been proposed that allegedly make people happy. And we find that we've been able to manualize many of them, and we actually carry out random assignment efficacy and effectiveness studies. That is, which ones actually make people lastingly happier. In a couple of minutes, I'll tell you about some of those results. But the upshot of this is that the mission I want psychology to have, in addition to its mission of curing the mentally ill, in addition to its mission of making miserable people less miserable, is, can psychology actually make people happier? And to ask that question, happy is not a word I use very much. We've had to break it down into what I think is askable about happy. And I believe there are three different, and I call them different because different interventions build them. It's possible to have one rather than the other. Three different happy lives. The first happy life is the pleasant life. This is a life in which you have as much positive emotion as you possibly can, and the skills to amplify it. The second is a life of engagement, a life in your work, your parenting, your love, your leisure. Time stops for you. That's what Aristotle was talking about. And third, the meaningful life. So I want to say a little bit about each of those lives and what we know about them. The first life is the pleasant life. And it's simply, as best we can find it, it's having as many of the pleasures as you can, as much positive emotion as you can, and learning the skills, savoring mindfulness, that amplify them, that stretch them over time and space. But the pleasant life has three drawbacks, and it's why positive psychology is not happyology, and why it doesn't end here. The first drawback is that it turns out the pleasant life, your experience of positive emotion, is heritable, about 50% heritable, and in fact, not very modifiable. So the different tricks that Mathieu and I and others know about increasing the amount of positive emotion in your life are 15 to 20% tricks. getting more of it. Second is that positive emotion habituates. It habituates rapidly, indeed. It's all like French vanilla ice cream. The first taste is 100%. By the time you're down to the sixth taste, it's gone. And as I said, it's not particularly malleable. And this leads to the second life. And I have to tell you about my friend Len to talk about why positive psychology is more than positive emotion, more than building pleasure. In two of the three great arenas of life, by the time Len was 30, Len was enormously successful. The first arena was work. By the time he was 20, he's an options trader. By the time he was 25, he was a multimillionaire and the head of an options trading company. Second, in play, he's a national champion bridge player. And but in the third great arena of life, love, Len is an abysmal failure. And the reason he was that Len is a cold fish. Len is an introvert. American women said to Len when he dated them, "You're no fun. You don't have positive emotion. Get lost." And Len was wealthy enough to be able to afford a Park Avenue psychoanalyst who for 5 years tried to find the sexual trauma that had somehow locked positive emotion inside of him. But it turned out there wasn't any sexual trauma. It turned out that Len grew up in Long Island and he played football and watched football and played bridge. Len is in the bottom 5% of what we call positive affectivity. So the question is Len unhappy? And I want to say not. Contrary to what psychology told us about the bottom 50% of the human race in positive affectivity, I think Len is one of the happiest people I know. He's not consigned to the hell of unhappiness, and that's because Len, like most of you, is enormously capable of flow. When he walks onto the floor of the American Exchange at 9:30 in the morning, time stops for him, and it stops till the closing bell. When the first card is played, till 10 days later, the tournament is over, time stops for Len. And this is indeed what Mike Csikszentmihalyi has been talking about flow, and it's distinct from pleasure in a very important way. Pleasure has raw feels. You know it's happening. There's thought and feeling. But what Mike told you yesterday, during flow, you can't feel anything. You're one with the music. Time stops. You have intense concentration. And this is indeed the characteristic of what we think of as the good life. And we think there's a recipe for it, and it's knowing what your highest strengths are. And again, there's a valid test of what your 5 highest strengths are, and then recrafting your life to use them as much as you possibly can. Recrafting your work, your love, your play, your friendship, your parenting. Just one example. One person I worked with was a bagger at Gennardi's. Hated the job. She's working her way through college. Her highest strength was social intelligence. So she recrafted bagging to make the encounter with her the social highlight of every customer's day. Now, obviously she failed, but what she did was to take her highest strengths and recraft work to use them as much as possible. What you get out of that is not smiliness. You don't look like Debbie Reynolds. You don't giggle a lot. What you get is more absorption. So that's the second path. The first path, positive emotion. The second path is eudaimonia and flow. And the third path is meaning. This is the most venerable of all the happinesses traditionally. And meaning in this view consists of, very parallel to eudaimonia, it consists of knowing what your highest strengths are and using them to belong to and in the service of something larger than you are. Well, I mentioned that for all 3 kinds of lives, the pleasant life, the good life, the meaningful life, people are now hard at work on the question, are there things that lastingly change those lives? And The answer seems to be yes, and I'll just give you some samples of it. It's being done in a rigorous manner. It's being done in the same way that we test drugs to see what really works. So we do random assignment, placebo-controlled, long-term studies of different interventions. And just to sample the kind of interventions that we find have an effect, when we teach people about the pleasant life, how to have more pleasure in your life, one of your assignments is to take the mindfulness skills, the savoring skills, and you're assigned to design a beautiful day. Next Saturday, set a day aside, design yourself a beautiful day, and use savoring and mindfulness to enhance those pleasures. And we can show in that way that the pleasant life is enhanced. Gratitude visit. I want you all to do this with me now, if you would. Close your eyes. I'd like you to remember someone who did something enormously important that changed your life in a good direction, who you never properly thanked. Person has to be alive. Okay? Now, okay, you can open your eyes. I hope all of you have such a person. Your assignment when you're learning the gratitude visit is to write a 300-word testimonial to that person, call them on the phone in Phoenix, ask if you can visit, don't tell them why, show up at their door, you read the testimonial. Everyone weeps when this happens. And what happens is when we test people 1 week later, a month later, 3 months later, they're both happier and less depressed. Another example is a strength state in which we get couples to identify their highest strengths on the strengths test and then to design an evening in which they both use their strengths. And we find this is a strengthener of relationships. And fun versus philanthropy, but it's so heartening to be in a group like this in which so many of you have turned your lives to philanthropy. Well, my undergraduates and the people I work with haven't discovered this, so we actually have people do something altruistic and do something fun, and to contrast it. And what you find is when you do something fun, it has a square wave walk set. When you do something philanthropic to help another person, it lasts, and it lasts. So those are examples of positive interventions. So the next to last thing I want to say is we're interested in how much life satisfaction people have. This is really what you're about. And that's our target variable. And we ask the question, as a function of the 3 different lives, how much life satisfaction do you get? So we ask, and we've done this in 15 replications involving thousands of people, to what extent does the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of positive emotion, the pleasant life, the pursuit of engagement, time stopping for you, and the pursuit of meaning contribute to life satisfaction? And our results surprised us. They were backward of what we thought. It turns out the pursuit of pleasure has almost no contribution to life satisfaction. The pursuit of meaning is the strongest, and this is the pursuit of engagement is also very strong. Where pleasure matters is if you have both engagement and you have meaning, then pleasure is the whipped cream and the cherry, which is to say the full life, the sum is greater than the parts if you've got all 3. Conversely, if you have none of the 3, the empty life, the sum is less than the parts. And what we're asking now is, does the very same relationship, physical health, morbidity, how long you live, and productivity follow the same relationship? That is, in a corporation, is productivity a function of positive emotion, engagement, and meaning? Is health a function of positive engagement, of pleasure, and of meaning in life? And there is reason to think the answer to both of those may well be yes. So Chris said that the last speaker had a chance to try to integrate what he heard, and so this was amazing for me. I've never been in a gathering like this. I've never seen speakers stretch beyond themselves so much, which is one of the remarkable things. But I found that the problems of psychology seem to be parallel to the problems of tech.
this does not make me happy. For some reason, some of these videos cause a random shutdown of the computer. Don't know quite why that happens. I thought I had the problem fixed, but it's doing it again now. So we'll pick back up with, he's almost finished there. So we'll probably just go ahead and move to the next one when we get back up. What have you noticed? What do you see? What do you see so far in the presentations on happiness? Approbation is a big one. The people who are happiest are the people who have good social relationships, right? They have a sexual relationship, and they have a approbation social type relationship. So there's, of course, the Danes, very interesting people, and a very interesting presentation there from 60 Minutes. If you have low expectations and you have enough money to get by, you can be happy, but not really happy. There's a lot of things you saw in that video about the lack of happiness, a lack of social interaction. It's their right to not talk to people. Okay? They're very unsociable and have happiness by lack of social. So it's quite interesting the way they define happiness and define the fact that they're not happy, even though they are happy, when you give them a test of happiness. So that would tell me that the test is not an accurate depictor of happiness. I think that we'll go ahead and try this approach rather than directing ourselves to YouTube for our video for this last one of this hour. We'll go with one that I've downloaded as an alternative just in case it didn't work the other way. So here we go.
We are wired to pursue happiness, not only to enjoy it, but to want more and more of it. So given that that's true, how good are we at increasing our happiness? Well, we certainly try. If you look on the Amazon site, there are over 2,000 titles with advice on the 7 habits, the 9 choices, the 14,000 thoughts that are supposed to bring happiness. There are so many books on it. Now, another way we try to increase our happiness is we medicate ourselves. And so there's over 120 million prescriptions out there right now for antidepressants. Prozac was really the first absolute blockbuster drug of the new psychopharmacology. It was really the avatar of the new psychopharmacology. It was clean, efficient, there was no high, there was really no danger, had no street value. Then we have, of course, the last way of increasing happiness for some. In 1995, illegal drugs were a $400 billion business, representing 8% of world trade, roughly the same as gas and oil. If all else fails, people just want to get obliterated. So far, these routes to happiness haven't really increased happiness very much. I don't have to speak for these cartoons. They kind of say what's going on here. Basically, the happiness from a pill stays with the pill. Anyone who goes off an antidepressant or other medication immediately tends to relapse. And then, of course, the other self-help books you see. One problem that's happening now is, although the rates of happiness are about flat as the surface of the moon, depression and anxiety are rising. Despite that we're in a world with so much more material wealth, much safer, better health, and all kinds of pharmaceuticals and treatments for mental illness, we're still seeing rises in depression and anxiety. Some people might say this is because we have better diagnosis and more people are being found out. It isn't just that. We're seeing it all over the world. In the United States right now, there are more suicides than homicides. There's a rash of suicide in China, and The World Health Organization predicts by the year 2020 that depression will be the second largest cause of disability-related years lost after ischemic heart disease. Happiness stays the same as ever. Now, the good news here is that if you take surveys from around the world, we find that more people are happy than not. And so I just took these random charts from Britain, this one's from the United States, and we see that about 3/4 of people will say they're at least pretty happy, the majority. But this does not follow any of the usual trends. So, for example, these two show great growth in income, absolutely flat happiness curves. So more money doesn't seem to be doing anything to increase happiness level. Well, my field, the field of psychology, hasn't done a whole lot to help us move forward in understanding human happiness. In part, we have the legacy of Freud, who was a pessimist, who said the pursuit of happiness is a doomed quest. It's propelled by infantile aspects of the individual that can never be met in reality. He said one feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. So the ultimate goal of psychoanalytic psychotherapy was really what Freud called ordinary misery. In part reflects the anatomy of the human emotion system, which is that we have both a positive and negative system, and our negative system is extremely sensitive. It is our sentinel. It is there to protect us against danger. So, for example, we're born loving the taste of something sweet and reacting aversively to the taste of something bitter. Yet we are much more sensitive to the bitter than the sweet. We can detect the bitter at 1 part per 2 million. We detect the sweet at 1 part per 200. We also find that people are more averse to losing than they are happy to gain. People are very loss averse. I also have up here the marriage formula. This is by a psychologist named John Gottman in Seattle, who does work with couples in couples therapy. And he finds that the formula for a happy marriage is 5 positive remarks or interactions for every 1 negative. And that's how powerful the 1 negative is. Especially expressions of contempt or disgust. Well, you really need a lot of positives to upset that. I also put in here the stress response. We're wired for dangers that are immediate, that are physical, that are imminent. And so our body goes into an incredible reaction where endogenous opioids come in. They are there to douse pain. Our blood vessels constrict so we won't bleed. Our heart pumps to get muscles to our legs. Now, all of these things are fine if we're confronting a saber-toothed tiger. But if someone is giving a violin recital or arguing with their spouse, we have a system that is really ancient, and it's really there for physical danger. And so over time, this becomes a stress response, which has enormous effects on the body. Cortisol floods the brain. It destroys hippocampal cells and memory, and it can lead to all kinds of health problems. But unfortunately, we need this system in part. If we were only governed by pleasure, we would not survive. As I said, we really have 2 command posts. Their emotions are short-lived, intense responses to challenge and to opportunity. And each one of them allows us to click into alternate selves that tune in, turn on, drop out, thoughts, perceptions, feelings, and memories. We tend to think of emotions as just feelings, but in fact, emotions are an all-systems alert that change what we remember, what kind of decisions we make, and how we perceive things. So let me go forward to the new science of happiness. We've come away from the Freudian gloom, and people are now actively studying this. And one of the key points in the science of happiness is that happiness and unhappiness are not endpoints of a single continuum. The Freudian model is really one continuum, that as you get less miserable, you get happier. And that isn't true. When you get less miserable, you get less miserable. And that happiness is a whole other end of the equation. And it's been missing from psychotherapy. So when people's symptoms go away, they tend to recur because there isn't a sense of the other half of what pleasure, happiness, compassion, gratitude, what are the positive emotions. And of course, we know this intuitively, that happiness is not just the absence of misery, but somehow it was not put forward until very recently, seeing these as 2 parallel systems so that the body can both look for opportunity and also protect itself from danger at the same time. They're sort of 2 reciprocal and dynamically interacting systems. People have also wanted to deconstruct. We use this word happy, and it's a very large umbrella of a term. And it can be deconstructed into, this is one recent suggestion, the sensory pleasures, amusement, contentment, relief, excitement, wonder, awe, ecstasy, from the carnal to the spiritual, elevation, gratitude, compassion. These are from Paul Ekman's recent work. And there's 3 emotions for which there are no English words. Fiero, which is sort of pride in accomplishment of a challenge. Schadenfreude, which is happiness in another's misfortune, kind of the malicious pleasure. And Nachas, for all people who know this word, is sort of pride and joy in one's children. Absent from this list and absent from any discussions of happiness are happiness in another's happiness. We don't seem to have a word for that. And I find that most distressing. We are very sensitive to the negative, but it's in part offset by the fact that we have a positivity offset. That is, most people are above the average in happiness, although we're very sensitive to the negative. We start out a little above the average in positivity. We're also born pleasure seekers. As I said, babies love the taste of sweet and hate the taste of bitter. They love to touch smooth surfaces rather than rough ones. They like to look at beautiful faces rather than plain faces. They like to listen to consonant melodies instead of dissonant melodies. Babies really are born with a lot of innate pleasures. People are also born with different temperaments. And so, as I said, we have this approach and avoidance system, and some people have a primed up approach system, and some people have a primed up avoidance system. So here we have an example of someone, born with a avoidance system. There's a lot of talk now in the science of happiness about, is it all genes? And there was once a statement made by a psychologist that said that 80% of the pursuit of happiness is really just about the genes, and it's as difficult to become happier as it is to become taller. That's nonsense. There is a decent contribution to happiness from the genes, about 50%, but there is still 50% that's unaccounted for, and even something such as intelligence, height, all kinds of things that have genetic predetermined also can increase quite a bit. So that doesn't limit us to the happiness we now have. Let's just go into the brain for a moment and see where does happiness arise from in evolution. We have basically at least 2 systems here, and they're both very ancient. One is the reward system, and that's fed by the chemical dopamine, and it starts in the ventral tegmental area, goes to nucleus accumbens, all the way up to prefrontal cortex, orbitofrontal cortex, where decisions are made high level. This was originally seen as a system that was the pleasure system of the brain. In the 1950s, Olds and Milner put electrodes into the brain of a rat, and the rat would just keep pressing that bar thousands and thousands and thousands of times. It wouldn't eat, it wouldn't sleep, it wouldn't have sex, it wouldn't do anything but press this bar. So they assumed, well, this must be the brain's orgasmatron. It turned out that it wasn't. That it really is a system of motivation, a system of wanting. It's a part of the brain that says, I need this to survive. It gives objects what's called incentive salience. It makes something look so attractive that you just have to go after it. That's something different from the system that is the pleasure system, which simply says, I like this. This feels good, this sounds good, I'm enjoying this, I feel safe, I feel warm, I feel good. The pleasure system, as you see, which is the internal opiates, there's a hormone, oxytocin, is widely spread throughout the brain. But the dopamine system, the wanting system, is much more centralized to this area, the pleasure pathway. The other thing about positive emotions is they have a universal signal. And we see here the smile. And the universal signal is not just raising the corner of the lips into the zygomatic major, it's also crinkling the outer corner of the eye, the orbicularis oculi. And can anyone tell which one is the fake and the real smile on top here? Yeah, it's B. This was originally done by the neurologist Duchenne in the 19th century. He had a man who was insensitive to pain. He stimulated every muscle on his face. He noticed that when he just raised his lips, he was grinning, but he didn't look happy. And since then, people have looked at this expression and find that this seems to be the mark of true happiness. So you see, even 10-month-old babies, when they see their mother, will show this particular kind of smile. Extroverts use it more than introverts. People who are relieved from depression show it more after than before. So if you want to unmask a true look of happiness, you will look for this expression. I also want to make the point that our pleasures are really ancient, and we learn, of course, many, many pleasures, but many of them are based, and one, of course, is biophilia, that we have a response to the natural world that's very profound. We have a response to human beauty. More people in the United States attend zoos than they do all of the national sporting events. People love to be part of the natural world, and this is very much a part of us. There were very interesting studies done on people recovering from surgery who found that people who faced, this was published in Science, people who faced a brick wall versus people who looked out on trees and nature, the people who looked out the brick wall were in the hospital longer, needed more medication, and had more medical complications. There's something very restorative about nature, and it's part of how we are tuned. Now, the interesting thing about emotions is that they're contagious. The shared manifold of subjectivity, I put those up in the animal world, and humans particularly so, we're very imitative creatures, and we imitate from almost the second we were born. Here's a 3-week-old baby, and if you stick your tongue out at this baby, the baby will do the same and will open its mouth. So most of our pleasures are incredibly social. We are social beings from the beginning, and even studies of cooperation show that cooperation between individuals lights up reward centers of the brain. One problem that psychology has had is instead of looking at this intersubjectivity or the importance of the social brain to humans who come into the world helpless and need each other tremendously, is that they focus instead on the self and self-esteem and not self-other. It's sort of me, not we. And I think this has been a really tremendous problem. It goes against our biology and nature and hasn't made us any happier at all. Because when you think about it, people are happiest when in flow, when they're absorbed in something out in the world, when they're with other people, when they're active, engaged in sports, focusing on loved one, learning, having sex, whatever. They're not sitting in front of the mirror trying to figure themselves out or thinking about themselves. These are not the periods when you feel the happiest. And I think the self-esteem movement has made it more difficult for people to be happy. The other thing is, the other piece of evidence is if you look at computerized text analysis of people who commit suicide, what you find there, and it's quite interesting, is use of the first person singular, I, me, mine, not we and us. And the letters are less hopeless and they are really alone. And being alone is very unnatural to the human. There's a profound need to belong. So self-focused attention brings mood down. But there are ways in which our evolutionary history can really trip us up. Because, for example, the genes don't care whether we're happy.
With the interruptions that we had with computer difficulties, our timing is not going to work out quite right. We're going to have to stop here and then pick up next hour. I had planned for this to be completed this hour, but again, the interruptions that we had with technical issues prolonged it. So we'll stop here with Dr. Etkoff and pick her up again next hour. You can see, of course, throughout all of this that there's a great deal of unknown in the happiness realm, and a lot of what we have talked about with the happiness attainment motivators. And we'll cover more of those, and you'll get to see more of those. And we'll deconstruct these at a later time. I just wanted to give you this introduction, these 2 hours, to the subject of what the world's viewpoint, the human viewpoint of human happiness is. So we can deconstruct it later so you can get a better idea. So let's close this hour with a word of prayer, and then we'll take about a 5-minute break and come back in and look at a couple of more of the experts on happiness. Father, we're grateful for our time together. We're grateful for the information that we are receiving. We're grateful for the Holy Spirit's insights into these things, and the Holy Spirit's promptings of the anti-biblical, anti-spiritual life nature of these ideas and concepts about happiness. We ask that the Spirit continue to work in our lives so that we might enjoy the joy of the filling of the Spirit as opposed to the temporary happiness that we could obtain through these methods that are espoused. We thank you again and ask that you bless this hour. In Jesus' name, amen.